Welcome to SFXOrgData by sfApex. My name is Kashyap Patel, and today we'll be looking at the more advanced functionality of the SFXOrgData app. Before we begin, we would suggest that if you haven't already viewed the basic usage video, that you do so before starting this video. In this video, we will cover the following features of SFXOrgData, starting with the Options dialog, and then covering the Advanced Transfer window, including the Links, Excluded Object, External IDs tab, the Validations tab, and Troubleshooting Failed Records. Before using the application, you want to make sure that you have the following permissions enabled on the user's profile you're using to log into both the source and destination orgs. If you don't already have all the required permissions set, the application will not let you log into the org through the app. After launching the application, you want to check for the latest updates to the app by either clicking the Check Updates button inside the Options dialog, or by restarting the application. The reason for restarting the application is that the app checks for updates after it's finished loading, and if it finds an update, it will prompt the user the next time the application is launched. Once we have the appropriate security settings in place and are running the latest version, we can start off by making sure the application settings in the Options dialog are set according to our requirements. On the first tab, General, we can define the Salesforce org's maximum query length. Currently, Salesforce is using a 10,000 character limit on all of their orgs, although they have a pilot program which increases this limit to 20,000. In future releases of Salesforce, this limit could increase by default, in which case you can set this value to reflect the increased length. If you set this value higher than what it is currently set on the Salesforce org, you will start seeing query length error messages when using the application. The higher the value is, the faster the application will be able to query Salesforce for records. The Display Tooltips option is great when you're first getting to know the application, although you may find after a while that they might get in the way when viewing data, so you can disable them from appearing by unchecking this box. Over on the next tab, Schema, the Include Text field when searching for key fields option is used when the application is looking for fields that reference other objects, for example, lookup fields and master detail fields. Enabling this option will instruct the application to also check text fields or anything that looks like an ID, and if found, uses its value as if they were references to other objects. Generally, if best practices are followed, this option will remain disabled, but we've seen some orgs where this option is needed. If selected, the application will query the number of records defined in the number of records to sample text box for each object to determine if it contains reference IDs. The default external ID field name is used if Use External IDs checkbox in the External IDs tab is checked in the Advanced Transfer window. When the application automatically creates external IDs, it will use this field label. This label should follow standard Salesforce naming conventions. The API name for the external ID field will be suffixed by an __C as usual. If you have already created your own external ID fields to trace the records back to the source org, you can type in the label of that field here, and the application will utilize that field when upserting records. You should note that the label will be used across all objects which have records selected to be copied over into the destination org. The Exclude Highly Referenced Object settings is used when the Excluded Objects tab under the Highly Referenced section in the Advanced Transfer window. If checked, the application will ignore objects that have a reference count greater than the threshold defined. The reference count is determined by summing the number of objects which reference the object and the number of objects referenced by the object. This setting is used only as a default value whenever you open the transfer window. You can change the value directly in the transfer window for individual transfer sessions. In the next tab, Transfer, you can set the memory size used during the transfer. This value is expressed in batches of approximately 200 records. To do the math, almost every object's record size is roughly 2 kilobytes, so a single batch of 200 records, the amount of memory used is 400 kilobytes or roughly half a megabyte. So with a queue size of 2000, the application will use at max a little less than 1 gigabyte of memory. The higher the queue size, the more independently the read and write threads can operate. The validations backup location defines where the application will save the backup of validations. The validations compose of the objects, workflow, and trigger files. During the transfer process, the application modifies these files in Salesforce. After the transfer is complete, the original files are loaded back into Salesforce. If for any reason the application crashes during the transfer process, the next time the transfer window is opened, the application will prompt you if you want to attempt to restore these files back into Salesforce. By default, this path is set to a subfolder within the application's directory. Next setting, replace record values where an inactive user ID is specified with the current user's ID, is used during the transfer process. When transferring records, if the record contains a reference to an inactive user in the destination org, the application will replace the value with the ID of the user account you used to log into the destination org. This is useful to orgs which have been around for a while and don't have their historical records updated to reference active users. If needed, you can run the mass transfer ownership on the source org to resolve some, if not all, of the references to inactive users. Once you have the option settings in place, go ahead and log into the source and destination orgs and click on the Advanced Transfer button to open the Advanced Transfer window. The links window displays the relationships between objects visually. To access links, click the View menu and select the Links menu item. With links open, you can click any object name throughout the different tabs in the transfer window to view the selected object's relationship with other objects. You can arrange the objects differently by selecting one of the options in the Layout drop-down list. You can configure additional layout options by clicking the Configure button. To view the reference fields on an object, you can click the Expand button on the object. To move an object to a different location, click the object and drag it to the new location. You can also use the Relayout button to recalculate the layout positions of the objects. Use the Zoom control to zoom in and out of the diagram. Use the 1-to-1 button to zoom the diagram so it displays the objects in their actual size. Use the Fill button to display all of the objects within one screen. The very first tab, Excluded Objects, displays the objects and fields we want the application to ignore. The Summary section in the tab displays a grid which shows which objects are available to be transferred and which objects are ignored by the application based on the selections in the subsequent sections. As we go through the subsequent sections, you can come back to this section to verify the status of the objects. The next section, Highly Referenced, we have a list of all objects and their reference counts. Remember that the reference counts are calculated based on the number of objects which reference this object, plus the number of objects this object references. If you click an object in this window, you can see the reference objects associated with the highlighted object. The reference count threshold is initially set to the threshold defined in the Options dialog. You can change the value here, which changes the objects the application will exclude. Use the ref count column to determine the threshold you want to use. If you have specific objects you want to exclude, you can use the subsequent sections to do this. The next section, Non-Queryable, displays a list of objects which have their queryable properties set to false in Salesforce. These objects are ignored by the application because it cannot be read the records in the object. In general, it's not recommended that you include these objects for use by the application. The next section, Non-Updatable, displays a list of objects which have their updatable properties set to false in Salesforce. These objects are ignored by the application because the records cannot be updated in the object. You may want to include some of these objects if you are not using external IDs or if you know you want to create these records for the first time in the destination org and will not need to be updated later by the app. The next section, Require Query Filter, displays a list of objects where, in order to query records from it, you have to specify a query filter. These are special objects in Salesforce where you have to specify a where clause to read its records. Since there isn't a Salesforce property on these objects which define if the object requires a query filter, you can use the Auto Detect button, which will query a single record from every object to determine if the object requires a query filter. This process can take a few minutes depending on the size of your org. If you know what these objects are beforehand, you can use the exclude button to manually identify these objects. For example, we found that if you're using the knowledge base feature, the article type objects require query filters. The next section, External ID Field Creation, displays a list of objects which don't support the creation of custom fields. Since external ID fields are custom fields, the external ID fields cannot be created for these objects. Use the exclude button if during the transfer you notice any error messages regarding the failed creation of an external ID field on that object. We've already identified the most common objects which we know do not support custom fields, but we've left this configurable so that the application can be used for future releases of Salesforce where more of these types of objects are added. Also, if you have certain features of Salesforce enabled, such as email to case or knowledge base, you may have to add those objects specific to those features here if applicable. The next section, System Defined Objects, displays a list of objects which get copied over by default from Salesforce when creating a sandbox. You can also use this section if you want to add any additional objects which don't fall into any of the previous sections. The next section, Key Fields, displays a list of uniquely labeled fields for all objects. This section is used to define fields across all objects which should be ignored when searching for reference field. The next section, Transfer Fields, is used to define fields whose record values should not be copied over to the destination org. You can define fields for specific objects or fields found on any object using the All Unique Fields tab. The next section, Metadata, displays a list of validation files, specifically object, workflow, and trigger files, that should be ignored by the application. These are typically special files which cannot be read from the org. If you notice any error messages regarding the inability to read object files during the creation of external IDs during transfer, you can exclude those files here. Also, if you notice any errors regarding the inability to read workflow and trigger files while disabling validations, again, you can exclude these files here. After you've finished making any modifications to the excluded objects list, be sure to check the Summary tab to verify that the objects you want to transfer are still highlighted in green. If you modify values in certain critical sections, you may be prompted to close and reopen the transfer for those changes to be reflected on the other transfer window tabs. Next, we'll cover the Insert Order tab. This tab shows the objects that are not referenced by any other objects in the independent list. For the objects which are referenced by other objects, they show up in the order dependent list. If you see an icon next to an object name, this means that the object has a circular reference to another object which also is displaying the circular reference icon. These circular references will be the last objects to have their records transferred. During the transfer process, the application will automatically figure out how to copy across any circular reference records by performing multiple iterations of the transfer process. In the next tab, Data Filter, you can now individually select the reference objects you want to include records for by using the Custom drop-down menu item. This will open links and put it in select mode. Here the key object is highlighted in blue. You can click individual objects to include or exclude reference records for them. When you click the object to include it, it will turn green. To quickly select reference child objects for the object you're including, set the Children toggle button list below to indicate how many levels of children should automatically be included or excluded. Once you're satisfied with the objects you want to include records for, click the Finish button. A few things to note in the Data Filter tab when dealing with objects that have a lot of records. Whenever you click on the object, you can use the red X button on the bottom right to stop the query after you have the number of records you're looking for. If you require a specific set of records, you should use the Add Where clause button because returning back 1,000,000 records for an object will take forever. If you have already included the records you're interested in, then use the Query Included Only button to pull back just those records. As a side note, the Include and Exclude All buttons apply to all of the records displayed on the grid and not all the records on the selected object. If you already have a text file containing the IDs of the records you want to include for this object, use the Include from File button. Now, after you have selected all of the records you want to include from all of the different objects, we would suggest that you use the Save Filters to Directory button to save your selections to files in case you want to come back later and transfer the same records across again. Loading these back from files is much faster than reselecting these records through the app each time, since the application has to scan all of the referenced objects to figure out the reference records. In the next tab, External IDs, you can review and set the external ID fields for the objects whose records you selected to transfer. We don't recommend disabling the use of external ID fields, as this may cause unwanted duplicate records, although there may be situations where this is needed. The default value for this can be modified in the Options dialog. If you're transferring data from your production org to your full sandbox, be sure to select the Use ID field as external ID. Since the ID field values for records between the production and sandbox orgs are identical, the application will use the ID field as the external ID field used during the upsert operations. The objects listed here are those which are not excluded in the Create External ID Field section in the Excluded Objects tab. By default, if the application finds a field on the object whose label matches the one identified in the Options dialog, in our case SFXID, it will use that as the external ID. If it doesn't find any fields which match the label identified in the Options dialog, it will create a new external ID field. You can use the drop-down menus next to each object if you either don't want to create an external ID field on the individual object, or if you want to use an existing external ID field which has a different label than the one identified in the Options dialog. The next tab, Validations, displays the triggers, required fields, and lookup filters, validation rules, workflows, and reparentable objects and fields which get disabled during the transfer process. You can use the Remove from List button in the appropriate sections to prevent the validation items from being disabled during the transfer process. By default, all validation items are disabled unless otherwise specified. Validation files excluded in the metadata section of the Excluded Objects tab will not have their related validation items displayed here and will not be disabled during the transfer process. In the next tab, Transfer, after you've completed the data transfer, you can click on any of the objects which appear under the error node to display the records which failed and the reason. If you select the erroneous records, the grid at the bottom will display the related parent records along with the transfer status for those records. This provides a quick way to diagnose why the records didn't get copied across. If the parent records display completed or the selected record doesn't have any parent records, then the root issue is the selected record itself. After the transfer process is completed, if you need to close the application and come back later to finish up the remaining records which failed, you can use the Save Error Record File button and later on use the Load Filters from Directory button in the Data Filter tab to select just those records again to transfer. If you have any questions, please visit our website at www.sfApex.com and click on the Contact Us tab to get in touch with us.